So this is Foundations of Sexual Violence, and this is part one of our training. Welcome and good morning. So here's a general overview of our webinar. So you might have noticed that there is a Foundations of Sexual Violence part one and a Foundations of Sexual Violence part two that you had to register for. That is because we are focusing on two kind of different ideas in this holistic view of our training. Part one is going to focus on our big ideas. Why are things the way they are? What are some big things that we need to focus on? And then the next part two, is going to be focusing more in on the details and the specific roles of advocates and some of the skills that they need to have. So again, today, big ideas, kind of sweeping to make sure that we are oriented to advocacy and sexual violence in our world in general. And then part two, we're going to focus in more specifically. Here are our learning points for part one. First, we're going to develop our understanding of sexual violence and sexual violence advocacy. Then we're going to review the traumatic impact of sexual assault and sexual violence. And then we're going to reflect on the distinct attributes of quality sexual violence services. Okay, so what we're going to do right now is we are going to do a Mentimeter. For those of you who aren't familiar with Mentimeter, this is a live polling function that you can use. They have a free version that has some things that you can use in your own advocacy programs when you're doing education out in the community, even just for a staff meeting, if that's what you want to do. And we like to use it a lot because the answers can be anonymous. So what you can do right now is go to www.menti.com and then type in the code 62894821. That's one thing you can do. Or Alex, I'm sure, and he has put a link in the chat to the Mentimeter if you're logging in on your computer. Or if you're a little bit more tech savvy, you can point your smartphone at the QR code by opening up your camera, focusing in on the QR code, that's the square on the screen, then it should also take you to the Mentimeter. And so I will give everyone a couple of seconds before I switch my screens over to start projecting those answers. Okay, I am going to switch my screen over now. Everyone see the Mentimeter screen on Mentimeter display on my screen. You can say yes in the chat, thumbs up, whatever works for you. Okay. Thank you, everyone. I'm seeing some thumbs up. Okay, so it looks like so far 3 folks have responded. How long have you been an advocate? If you're having trouble with the Mentimeter, that's okay too. Put your answer in the chat. We'll monitor that as well. How long have you been an advocate? Okay, Eric, no problem. Okay. So it looks like folks are responding. I really appreciate it. So we have a mix of knowledge in the room, as we can see. We have folks, some folks have been in advocacy for less than a year. Some folks have been between less than 4 years, and some folks more than 12 years. So that's amazing. So I'm hoping that everyone This is going to be a very interactive training, or as interactive as we can be on a webinar. So I hope that you all are willing to share your experiences, some of the things that you've learned in your advocacy, if you're a little bit more seasoned. And if you're new, feel free to ask all the questions. This is definitely the space to do so. I'm going to switch back to my presentation screens now. Okay. Everyone see we're back on the Mentimeter slide? Perfect and wonderful. And I didn't say this in the beginning, but again, please feel free to put your questions wherever you would like in the Q&A spot. We are going to stop midway to make sure that there aren't any questions, but whenever you have them, please make sure to put them in the box. All right, for our introduction, what is sexual violence? Why are we here today? Why do we have to have a 90-minute or 3-hour total training on just the foundations? So there's many different definitions of what people describe as sexual violence. We at the Iowa Coalition Against Sexual Assault describe sexual violence as any type of unwanted conduct that happens without a person's consent. We also use the term sexual violence very intentionally because that can mean a lot of different things, and it can mean all of these different terms on the slide. We call this an umbrella term. Some of the ones on the slide are rape, stalking, sexual extortation, sexual harassment, unwanted sexual conduct, sex trafficking, sexual coercion, non-contact unwanted sexual experiences, made to penetrate, and sexual harassment. Okay? And so typically when people outside of the anti-violence movement or victim advocates are talking about sexual violence, they will say terms like rape, or they might say things like sexual assault. We at the Iowa Coalition Against Sexual Assault tend to say sexual violence because terms like rape have a legal standing attached to them. Under the federal definition, rape has to involve penetration of someone's body. And this does not include experiences when someone is forced to penetrate someone else. Particularly in Iowa, it's important for us to note Iowa law does not recognize sexual assault as a legal term. What some people might refer to as rape or sexual assault is called sexual abuse under Iowa code. All that's to say, right, while it's important for advocates to recognize some of the legal terms that intersect with sexual violence and can have an impact on survivors if they're dealing with the criminal legal system, it's important to remember as sexual violence advocates, we can support all survivors of sexual violence, even if what they experience doesn't align with the legal definition. And so Alex was so helpful and already put the definitions of sexual violence in the chat. You might notice that this came from the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, and they describe sexual violence different than us. And that's okay, right? In different places and different organizations will describe it differently, but generally we're talking about the same thing unless it comes to legal definitions. Underneath that large umbrella, you might have seen contact sexual violence and non-contact sexual violence. Contact sexual violence is any type of sexual act that includes physical contact with someone's body. So this can be with another person's body part, such as their hand, their mouth, etc., or it can be with another object. Non-contact sexual violence is a sexual act that happens without physical contact. So this can include actions that happen in person, such as catcalling or street harassment, as you might be more familiar with it being called, and things that happen online or virtual. In the middle of these two sections here are a parts of larger patterns of behavior fall again under that umbrella of sexual violence. They can consist of both contact and non-contact behaviors. So for example, A person might kiss their coworker without consent, and then they might threaten to spread lies about them at their job. This shows a pattern of behavior that even though there are a variety of actions, they are all still sexual violence. Because we've already used a definition of sexual violence that included consent, we should also define consent as well. We define consent as agreeing to sexual conduct freely and willingly without being forced or coerced. That means that someone cannot consent if they feel like they can't refuse, can't choose what they want to do and what not to happen. And this isn't limited to just physical threats, but it's also the perceived idea that their mental, physical, emotional, sexual, and other types of well being can be impacted by their choice. Someone isn't able to give or revoke permission for sexual activity, that is not consent. If they are afraid to express what they want and need, this is also not consent. And this can be for a variety of different reasons, like fear or, again, perceived threats of sexual violence. Someone can't consent if they don't understand what's happening. So this applies to children and some folks with developmental and intellectual disabilities, but it also applies to people who are under the influence, sleep deprived, or are sleeping. Someone is not able to rationally communicate what they want and how to proceed with sexual activity, again, they cannot consent. So we also, I'm going to go back one slide a bit. So the bottom of this slide says without being forced or coerced. So has anyone ever heard of the term sexual coercion before? If you have, you can raise your hand, put up, just say yes in the chat. Oh, wait a moment. Have you heard of the term sexual coercion? Okay, I'm getting some thumbs up. Great, great, great. So we often like to go to this study that was done by Carl and Van Dutzen, and then also Strickman, Johnson, and Anderson. And it really found that there are types of behaviors of and patterns and tactics of sexual coercion that are consistent and precede other types of sexual violence, right? So you might remember in that umbrella slide, sexual coercion was on there, but sexual coercion is actually a tool or a tactic that's used to perpetrate or do other types of sexual harm. So they found that there are four broad categories of sexual coercion. The first was verbal and emotional manipulation. And this is if you're showing displeasure or repeatedly asking for sexual conduct or telling lies about that person's retaliation, basically using verbal coercion to change someone's decision. After that, identified intoxication. This is taking advantage of an intoxicated person or purposely getting someone in an elevated state where they would normally make decisions they wouldn't or can't make decisions. And this would include sleep deprivation as well. Then we have persistent sexual advances. And this would be things like persistent kissing and touching and taking off clothes without consent. Essentially, this would be continuing sexual behavior without getting permission. And the last one on this list is physical force, threats, and harm. And these are things like physically harming or restraining someone or threatening them with bodily harm or with a weapon. So now we're going to have a poll question for you all. And the question is, what do you think from this research is the most common type of sexual coercion that happens? And so, Alex, you can now launch the poll. Thank you so much for being on top of it. What is the most often used sexual coercion tactic? Okay, we've got about 70% voting. I'd like us to around 80% before we move forward. And I know some of you may not be able to use the full range of Zoom function, so that's okay. Great. So thank you all so much for participating in this poll. I'm going to share the results now. So the most common answer on our poll was verbal emotional manipulation. But in reality, and it says it on the poll as well, correct answer is persistent sexual advances. So that happens 65% of the time. And then it is verbal emotional manipulation, intoxication, and then physical threats, right? And you might be looking, and if you're a mathematician, you might be looking at those numbers and say, Lachey, that does not add up to 100%. And what this research found was that oftentimes these tools, these tactics were used in conjunction with each other. So someone might use one or more of these tactics to then do sexual harm. So I want us to keep that in mind as we're really getting into the foundations of sexual violence, thinking about how sexual violence shows up in our world, right? In what we see in the media, in our discussions with everyday folks, and just out and about, and even maybe within our own social circles, does this match up to what people say sexual violence looks like? Does this match up with our ideas? Does this match up with maybe some of our policies? Does this match up to how we navigate the world? Just kind of keep that in mind. With that, we're going to go over our first key points of the training. One, sexual violence includes a range of actions and behaviors. And while the terms on the slide, again, were very big, there are lots of different actions and behaviors that we could talk about. And we do talk about in many different webinars and trainings, right? Because each of them show up differently and affect survivors differently. The next point we really want to make sure that we know is that all types of sexual violence behaviors are violent and harmful. So sometimes people might say, like, oh, sexual harassment isn't that serious, right? There is less funding to support those who've experienced sexual harassment specifically, right? We specifically talk about sexual assault, which is a contact sexual violence term. But as sexual violence advocates, it's important for us to know and then build our advocacy upon the idea that all sexual violence behaviors are violent and harmful, even if they are not physical or outwardly aggressive, right? All of it is still sexual violence. Okay, so now we're going to move on to our next section, ripples and bounce back. How does sexual violence impact our society at all levels? So when people experience sexual violence, they may go through a wide range of traumatic effects. If you have attended some of the resource sharing project webinars before, you would know that we have done trainings and a couple of trainings on just mental health and sexual violence, right? And we've even dived into dissociation and sexual violence. We've talked about all of these things on the slide at length, right? But these are just some general effects of sexual violence. Anxiety and depression, substance use, chronic pain, and this pain may show up as physical pain that happens as a result of the sexual violence experience. So if someone's arm was broken during the sexual violence, or it can show up much later as gastrointestinal issues. That is actually one of the most common long-term issues that sexual violence survivors experience that is related and correlated to sexual violence, even if their stomach was not impacted during the experience. Self-harm, and this also includes behaviors that we may not typically think of, right? This is actually survivor defined. So what I might say is self-harm is eating past the point that I'm full, and someone else might define as self-harm as working out to the point that that they're not able to move, right? So self-harm needs to be survivor defined, and that doesn't always line up with the research. But we have to remember, as advocates, survivors get to define their experience and choose how they talk about it. They might have low self-esteem. They might experience suicidal ideation. They might have an inability to focus. This might show up as nightmares. This could be hypersexuality. And so we define hypersexuality as survivors engaging in sexual contact and activity in a way they perceive to be unhealthy, right? And so we, again, do not make judgment calls about what is healthy for a sexual, how survivors can healthily engage in sex. That's for them to determine. They might have difficulty with relationships and trust, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in more detail. Sexual violence has also been linked to fertility issues, and especially in adults who experience sexual abuse as children. They might feel and experience increased levels of isolation. There is a wide range of health issues, substance use, and then mental health issues. So I also want to make sure that we know that for different populations, there are also varying levels and trends on how each of these effects of sexual violence impact those groups. So, for example, men are prone to also experiencing PTSD, but also higher levels of suicidal ideation if they experience childhood sexual abuse, right? So again, different types of populations and different types of identities experience some of these effects at higher rates. It's also important that we realize that these effects can show up at any point in a survivor's life and can be exacerbated by different issues like stress or experiencing additional violence or traumatic events. But throughout our life, a person might experience a lot of other factors too. And so we have created this person, Marco. And so we're going to use the example of their life throughout the training. So again, this is not a real person. We made this up for the purpose of the training. So Marco was sexually abused as a child by a family friend. So this abuse started when Marco was around 8, but they didn't disclose to their parents what had happened, so he was 10 years old. It's also important to note, right, that statistics find that children who experience sexual abuse often do so before the age of 10. And we have to think about why that might be, right? When you're 10 and before that, you may not be able to communicate as well. You're very much under the authority of the adults in your life and those who are older in your life. You are physically more likely to be overpowered, and a lot of other factors that I'm sure you all are thinking of. It's also important to remember that often when children disclose sexual abuse, they are often met with sympathy and empathy, access to services, and focus on getting them support. That is if they're believed, and we know not all children are. Let's keep looking at Marco's life. Family friend called immigration on Marco's family after they made a report. After immigration officials came to Marco's house at night, he refused to talk to anyone about what happened. Marco was diagnosed with a sleep disorder at 11. Marco watched his mom be sexually harassed daily when he picked him up from school. So we can see how sexual violence might have had an impact on these otherwise unrelated events in Marco's adolescence, right? And if we didn't know these things about Marco, we might not see if there's any connection. We can also see in Marco's life that they've experienced multiple instances of sexual violence, which is a reality for those who experience childhood sexual abuse, but also they are more likely to experience sexual violence in adulthood. So let's take this a step further. So Marco is, again, not a real person, right? But this often reflects on what happens in survivors' lives. So we see them experience sexual violence. They have traumatic reactions and engage in disruptive coping, and then they are later punished for this behavior. A lot of the times, the way traumatized youth show up, show distress, related to how they're socialized or taught to show emotion, and they are later punished and criminalized for this. So even if it does not rise to the level of them going to juvenile detention, they are punished for reacting to the trauma that they experience. It may show up as them not paying attention in class, or they're seen as acting out or troublemakers, or they stop caring about things, or they're unable to focus, right? And if we go back a couple of slides, we can see that a lot of these behaviors are consistent with some of the um, traumatic implications and effects of sexual violence. So instead of seeing someone who needs support and attention, they're seen as someone who is deserving of punishment. But this happens so often that youth are punished and criminalized that it's actually called the sexual abuse to prison pipeline. And we could share some resources about that when we send out the copy of the slides. Okay. Let's look at Marco's life one more time. Marco confronted one of the people harassing his mom on his school scholarship committee. Next semester, his scholarship was not renewed. Marco was sexually assaulted while at a music festival. Marco, oh, oops, sorry. Marco passed out while driving due to exhaustion. He totaled his car and couldn't afford to get his hearing aids fixed. Marco found out he was HIV positive at 31. Marco didn't share all the sexual violence experiences he had with his sister until near the end of her life. So, seeing the full context of Marco's life, you can see that they experienced a whole wide range of traumas, and this still isn't everything. If we just talked about the sexual violence he experienced, which are these 4 items on the top in blue, we would miss all the health and social factors that impacted his life and other types of traumas that he experienced. I also want to note we don't know all the joy that Marco experienced in their life, so this is an incomplete view. But the view that we get from survivors that we work with is usually even more limited. The point is that for Marco and many other survivors, sexual violence doesn't just stop affecting them at the age of 18 or 36 or whenever they can stop in to make it to our office. We also want to note that Marco also has a disability. And one study found that folks with disabilities are 7 times more likely to experience sexual violence. As service providers, we need to reflect on our services and ask, how are we meeting the needs of survivors across their lifespan? But we know that sexual violence doesn't just impact individuals. When a person experiences sexual violence, it has effects on their larger community and their ecosystem, if I will. I'll change that up, their ecosystem for this part. So within the family, when sexual violence happens, there's usually some level of victim blaming, mistrust, and that can be mistrust of each other, mistrust of systems, mistrust of people outside of the family unit. Might be involvement with legal systems. There's often some level of secondary trauma. So let's remember from Marco's story, he witnessed his mom being sexually harassed. There's an increased concern for survivors and others. So for Marco, this could have shown up as not being allowed, to go to sleepovers anymore. That's something common that we see when sexual violence is disclosed by children. That is something that we see parents try to do as a protective factor. There might be broken relationships. There could be missing employment due to having to go to court, due to feelings of depression and anxiety, all these different things. And there's a level of guilt, usually. And then within the community, there's also effects on that, right? There's a level of mistrust, of not knowing who to trust in the community. There is a perpetuation of rape culture and rape myths. There is also less community safety because people don't trust each other and people are not held accountable. More disconnection, and that drives more community-wide trauma. Then we have this outside of these three circles, all of these things affect our larger society. Each of these layers are interrelated. So what happens to the individual impacts the community, and what happens to communities impacts the individual. So another example that is not specifically sexual violence related is let's use the example of the wildfires going on in California, right? That affects entire communities and the policies and the things that happen. So for example, one of the planes that helped with to put out the flames was it had to go down for a couple hours for repairs, right? So that personally could have impacted someone's ability to save their home, their business, and someone who flew the drone into the plane, right? That impacts entire communities, right? So what happens at the large level impacts the individual, and what happens to the individual impacts our community. Particularly within families, we know that sexual violence can cause a lot of hurt, confusion, and broken trust. Particularly, right, when sexual violence happens within families, this is referred to as incest, right? And this is often the most difficult work for survivors of sexual violence to entangle and for advocates to support survivors with. When sexual violence happens, it can also cause further disruption to the life of the survivor if someone has to leave the home, if they no longer are able to connect with their family by going to gatherings, talking as frequently as they do, if they are removed from the family unit, and that is the survivor or the person that harmed them. Even if it happens outside of the family, often it's the people closest to the survivor who experience some of those feelings of anger, isolation, and shame. This might be, again, the parents, it could be other people who are caregivers within the home, it can be siblings, it can be partners, so on and so forth. Sexual violence breaks down relationships within families, which causes further trauma in the lives of survivors. And within families, trust and access are used to break down protections and support for the person experiencing sexual violence. So when this second point on the slide, right, when families, trust and access are used to break down protections and support, this might be what you might be more familiar with as grooming, right? This is grooming behavior. So when people in the family are intentionally targeted to either remove support from the survivor or to remove support from the survivor or to gain trust in order to dismiss what the survivor might be experiencing or feeling, that is the practice of grooming, right? And it happens very often, not just with children, but but also with adults as well. And then what happens, as we saw in that kind of chart that we had, what happens in our families impacts our communities. Sometimes what we see is that communities do not know how to respond to sexual violence when it occurs. Instead, we might see blame, shame, and disbelieving the person that experienced sexual violence after a certain point. Now, this might be dependent on who the survivor is. They might not be believed at all, or could be provided the support with it that they needed, right? We also see that people blame, shame, and pass judgment on the family as well. So instead of providing tangible support with people like connecting them with job opportunities or helping them connect with legal aid or just finding out how you can support the family with their specific needs, people are instead isolate and blame them for not stopping the harm, for being too naive and letting, and these are air quotes, right? We know that people don't let sexual violence happen, but letting the violence happen, or they criticize them for bringing shame into the community. Something else that happens is people might deny that the person that did the sexual violence accountability, or instead focus on ostracizing and punishing them without supporting the survivor, right? Their main focus is just punishing that person. But this isn't limited to the general community, right? Even sexual violence advocates struggle to develop community-wide responses to sexual violence. So we're supposed to be the experts, and we're not always sure how to do this. How can we expect our communities to change, right? How can we end sexual violence? Well, sometimes, right, we use this picture of the pool balls because sometimes individuals in our community are operating and just bumping into each other, going every which way without any real direction or a sense of how to respond to sexual violence holistically as a community. And if we keep approaching this issue one survivor at a time and we don't address family and communities, sexual violence will continue to happen. So we saw Marco's story, right? And there were a couple of different identities that Marco had that we were able to identify. Um, and this feeds into, again, one of our larger points. So we know that people who are targeted for sexual violence and people, sorry, let me back up. So those who target people for sexual violence usually do so because they perceive that person, we might say the survivor, as being and falling into one or more of these categories. They're seen to be more accessible, more vulnerable, and less credible. Again, survivors are often seen and targeted for sexual violence because they're seen to be more accessible or they have more access to them. They're considered to be more vulnerable and they have lower levels of credibility. So it's less likely that people will believe them. So when you think about who this might be or which groups of people this might be, who might fall into this middle category right here, or even two of these categories? If you could please put your answer in the chat. Who is at the intersections of being considered more accessible, more vulnerable, less credible? Children and women. Okay. Who else? There's a lot of different groups and types of people who might fall into this space. So who might be considered having more access to them, more vulnerable, and less credible? Elderly with memory issues? Yeah, tell me more about that. Why specifically elderly with memory issues? Yeah. Again, not saying you're wrong, just tell me more about that. Children and immigrants, especially if they're undocumented. Yeah, right. There's different vulnerabilities that come with being undocumented, with different vulnerabilities that we already discussed with being a child. Um, someone said immediate family. Yeah, you might be more vulnerable to your immediate family. Absolutely. Thank you for that. Folks with disabilities, different abilities. Yeah. Who else? We're going to spend a little bit of time on this slide because, again, this is a webinar, but I want to interact with you all as much as possible. Language barriers, absolutely. Thank you all so much for your answers. We spent some time talking about this too. Here's what we identified, right? People who are using substances, including prescribed medication. What else is someone? Yeah, those who are homeless or unsheltered, children, undocumented immigrants. Yeah, that was one of the ones we said. Who are unsheltered or housing insecure. Those who are sexually active already, right? So we often see as a part of these myths of sexual violence, as you might call them, or victim blaming behaviors. People might say, well, they are already they have sex with so many people, so they're obviously lying, right? That's just typical behavior for them. Youth who are in foster care, people in detention settings, people with criminal or school records, and folks who are poor or are lower social economic status, right? Um, so you, so these are just some different groups that we identified. Also, some of the things that you all said in the chat, so I really appreciate it. Again, these rates differ for each of these populations that we identified. Now, again, think about what we see in the media or who our society says is perpetrating sexual violence or doing sexual violence, right? Oftentimes, the research that we have says that these groups are often the ones more likely to experience violence. So, here are our next key points. Sexual violence causes traumatic impacts in many areas of survivors' lives. And on the surface, things that might not be or seem related still may be connected to the sexual violence that they experience. We also have to remember that every survivor is different and will respond differently when they experience sexual violence. Sexual violence impacts every level of our society, and our society often misrepresents what sexual violence looks like, who experience it, and how often it happens. Okay, so we are about at our halfway point. So I just want to stop and check in to make sure there aren't any questions. Okay, I'm not seeing any, but if there are, please make sure you put them in the Q&A box, and I want to make sure that we answer them today. Okay. So our next part is going to focus on comparing and reflecting, right? Why are we focusing so much on specifically sexual violence advocacy? So we have, I think, about 2 more chat questions, and then I promise you can sit back for the rest of the webinar. First question I want to ask you are, first questions I would like to ask you are, what are the types of relationships someone can have in a DV relationship? Another way to think about this is, how do they know one another? And the second question is, what are the types of relationships someone can have in a sexual violence relationship? How do they know each other? What are the types of relationships someone can have in a DV relationship? How do they know one another? What are the types of relationships someone can have in a sexual violence relationship? How do they know or relate to one another? What's that relationship? Someone said DV, intimate partner, household members, parents, child together, family members. You might be married to that person. Uh-huh. What else? Someone said they can have a relationship depending on how they know each other through a group meeting. Is that for domestic violence or for sexual violence? Person said unhealthy or abusive spouses, or they could be dating. For both. Okay, we'll talk about that a little bit more. Former partner, a parent with incest, absolutely. Someone said there could be a lot of overlap. Mm-hmm. The partners, family members, exes, sexual violence, strange, but that's supposed to be same, but add in strangers and friends. Second question, financial needs. Okay. Yeah, thank you. And I really appreciate you all who are participating in the chat. It means a lot. Okay. So what we found is that there is, like some of you all said, there is an overlap of relationships people can have with domestic violence and sexual violence. There are some that are distinct, right? But for domestic violence, that has to be an intimate partner. It there needs to be related or be a current or former romantic partner, right? Um, for those who experience sexual violence, relationship to that person could be anyone, right? This could be a stranger, an acquaintance, a roommate. I think that came up quite a bit. This could be someone who is on a position of authority, so a teacher, mentor, or coach. This could be a faith leader. Um, this could be many types of things for sexual violence, right? Like we said, is an overlap. So that could be the person who harmed you could be your spouse, your current or former romantic partner, right? Um, this could be a person who was sexually abused in childhood by a family member. Reproductive coercion, oftentimes is an intersection between domestic and sexual violence. Incest and sexual exploitation can also happen in an intimate partner sexual violence situation or a family sexual violence situation. What are the differences is that for domestic violence, that depends on the relationship, right? So, that those two people have to have a romantic or familial tie for it to be domestic violence. But sexual violence is dependent on the action and the behavior. So that's something that we really want to make sure that we're distinct about. Yes, intimate partner sexual violence happens, and it happens quite frequently. And there are distinct differences between the relationship someone can have a domestic violence relationship and sexual violence. Okay. So with that, what are some of the distinct needs of domestic violence survivors, and what are some of the needs of sexual violence survivors? To be heard, need to feel safe, DV, safety, housing, transportation, financial resources, legal representation, housing. Is that for domestic violence survivors or sexual violence survivors? Both. Thank you. Housing and financial for both. Okay. Wanting to feel safe, cared for, wanted, understood, etc. Yeah. Medical care for who? For domestic violence survivors or sexual? Both. Okay. They both need caring, trauma informed, empathetic support and connections with community resources. Yeah, thank you all so much. So, again, we've at Iowa Cost, but specifically at the Resource Sharing Project, have done national research about the needs of sexual violence survivors. And consistently, what we found, and I don't want to make sure I don't want to miss anyone, sexual violence, emotional support and safety planning, employment advocacy, housing advocacy, legal representation. The more I type out, the more I realize there's overlap. Absolutely. Thank you so much. Um, yes. So, like I was saying, we have done research about this and we have asked survivors directly what are their needs. And consistently, their needs are to be believed, to have access to consistent and non judgmental emotional support, and access to healing and safety. Even if they are not able to receive anything tangible, which is often the needs of domestic violence survivors, we could still help them and do these things. And so this is our next key point. If the relationships are different and the needs are different, then our advocacy also has to be different, right? I think some of you were saying this in the chat, right? But specifically for domestic violence survivors, there's a lot more emphasis on those tangible and crisis needs, right? It's about helping someone's safety plan. It's about getting protective orders, right? It's about getting those basic needs. And a lot of times it's about external and physical resources. And there's a lot more systems and clear responses to domestic violence. For sexual violence survivors, oftentimes the place that they need to feel safe is within their own bodies, right? Many sexual violence survivors, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, don't report. So they don't qualify for some of the systems responses that are available to domestic violence survivors. Also, a lot of the needs and things that they want is about healing from the sexual violence that they experience, right? Safety planning is also going to look more different, and it's going to be focused on a lot more working through triggers. And again, this can apply for both domestic and sexual violence survivors, but these are the needs that consistently come up for sexual violence, which are a lot less tangible, right? So, for example, one thing that we could help a sexual violence survivor plan for is returning home after returning home for the holidays, and they know the person that sexually that did sexual harm is going to be there, or a person that blamed them for the sexual harm they experienced is also going to be there. That is a unique experience for sexual violence survivors. And we know, again, that survivors that exist in communities, people might experience both sexual and domestic violence, but the advocacy that we provide sexual violence survivors is going to look a little bit different. Does that make sense to everyone? If I need to talk more about this, I definitely can. And not to dismiss again that there is overlap. People need access to housing. We are part of a lot of different initiatives that talk about specifically sexual violence and housing and those needs. And some of these needs are distinct as well. Okay. So our last bit for this afternoon, and it looks like we are going to get you out on time, if not a little bit before, so that's good. But our last section for this afternoon is thinking about our programs. What does it mean to serve sexual violence survivors as an organization? And what are pillars of sexual violence programs? So, something that we refer to a lot, and when we're building our trainings, when we're thinking about the support we offer to advocacy programs, is built on the information from the Sexual Assault Demonstration Initiative. So this was a 10-year project in which several folks from the Resource Sharing Project, the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, and other culture-specific TA providers came together and went into provided intensive TA to different dual and multi-service sexual violence programs. And as a part of that project, they found out a couple of key things that were consistent in advocacy programs that provided comprehensive, long-term, and quality services to sexual violence programs. And I think Alex is going to give you one of those resources in the chat now. Alex, maybe I skipped this one. I don't think I did, though. Okay, thank you so much. So those are the other lessons that came out of the city, right? So in the whole 10-year project, they found out there are key traits from sexual violence programs that they needed to have in order to really be able to serve sexual violence survivors in dual and multi-service organizations. What I found, and the one we're going to focus on today specifically, is that if our programs are just copying and pasting our domestic violence services and calling them sexual violence services, then they're not really meeting the needs of our whole community, and we are going to continue to miss the needs of sexual violence survivors. So I am not here to tell you what specific services that your organization has to offer or needs to offer, right? That is set by the state, and we firmly believe Iowa CASA that the sexual violence services that your organization provides needs to be driven by the needs of your community. So this is not only survivors that are already connected to our services, but these are survivors who exist in our community and their support system as well. So many of the survivors in our communities generally want safety, stability, and the ability to thrive, right? But even within that, there are going to be vastly different histories within our community and experiences with individuals, within families, and within smaller communities within our larger communities, for example. So even if I gave you at the end of this training today an exact list of how to stop sexual violence and how it works in my community, it wouldn't stop what's happening in your community, your specific community in Iowa, right? Because all of our communities are different. We have access to different resources. The physical environments are different. The population sizes are different and identities are different. So the services that we offer might all have the same base, but need to be uniquely crafted to fit the needs of those in your community who are accessing services and supporting those who access services. So that was like, again, my big, large spiel. That was me on my soapbox. I'm going to step off it now. But here's some other attributes that we have found for programs to provide quality sexual violence survivors. They are able to support survivors across the lifespan. So remember a couple of slides ago where we talked about Marco? They will be able to support Marco when he was a child, in his adolescence, and as an adult, and as an older adult, right? So we're talking for people who might be older than 65. But what we found consistently and what was found as a part of the research of the SADE was that many advocacy programs struggle to promote survivors who have not recently experienced sexual violence. So oftentimes when we say medical advocacy in the terms of sexual violence, people immediately go to medical forensic exams or sexual abuse exams, right? And that is a part of it. But that is only going to be available to a very select few group of sexual violence survivors who want to get a medical forensic exam, and the sexual violence has happened very recently. More specifically, we found that programs have struggled to support teens and children, adult survivors of child sexual abuse, and older adults, right? And this is in terms of outreach, this is in terms of creating specific services, and this is in terms of also evaluating the services that they provide. We also found that programs also struggle to support immigrant survivors, incarcerated survivors, and survivors of sexual violence outside of an intimate partner context, as well as people who experience non-contact sexual behaviors. Non-contact sexual violence, excuse me. So this is just a question that I'm posing for you to reflect on yourselves. And again, you will get a copy of the slides if you attended today. Who are you most commonly seeing in your program? What groups are they a part of? What identities do they hold? On the other side, who are you not seeing in your program, but you know they are a part of your community? And it's good to just have this information. We're not telling you all to change your services automatically overnight. We know your funding doesn't probably support that. That would be jarring to you and your staff. But if we want to make sure that we and continue to say that we serve all survivors, we have to make sure that we're doing that. And that starts by knowing who is in our community. Alex has put into the chat a resource that came from the resource sharing project. Um, really dives into this. Another attribute is of programs who provide quality sexual violence services is that they have a range of services outside of criminal legal response. And this is, again, not saying not to have services for criminal legal response. That's not what we're saying. We're saying that they have to have a balance and an equitable amount of services outside of criminal legal responses. The reason we say this is because the vast majority of sexual violence survivors do not report their sexual assault, and less sexual violence survivors sorry. So the vast majority of sexual violence survivors do not disclose to law enforcement, and if they disclose at all, right? So adult survivors of child sexual abuse are the least likely to disclose. Um, but still, the vast majority of sexual violence survivors do not report to law enforcement, right? And this is for a variety of reasons: historical state violence, disbelief in the resolution of the legal process. They might be victim blamed by those in the system. There's barriers and lack of knowledge about what they can even do, what their options are within the criminal legal system, and they might believe that doing so will cause more damage in their lives, right? And so this is for a variety of reasons. Want to make sure that we have a range of services available to survivors. Some legal advocacy and other things besides legal advocacy as well. What could this look like? A survivor wants to speak out against the person that posted their nude photos online. They don't want to report to law enforcement, but they're interested in quote unquote getting justice. So, what are some things that advocacy programs could do? The survivor could be able to walk into our drop in location and talk to an advocate without making an appointment. They are able to talk to an advocate, and they leave the office with a referral to a therapist who has previously supported sexual harassment survivors. Or the advocate speaks with the survivor about what justice means to them. The advocate informs the survivor about how to report the activity on social media and the upcoming survivor speak out that they're planning. So again, these are just an example of some of the services that we can offer survivors that still meet their healing needs and still respond to the specific needs of the survivor identified, in this case, which was quote unquote getting justice. Another attribute that quality sexual violence programs have is they have many types of community collaborations, right? Um, that means that they are able to help survivors find places in the community outside of formal systems to receive support. So they might know someone who is able to um, help them with a job. They might know someone who's able to mow their grass. They might know someone who could teach them new skills so that they're able to make money for their families, right? Outside of these formal systems, the advocate and the advocacy program has many different connections to help survivors meet their needs. This also means, right, that our services should be offered outside of just our organization and bring other services and supports in. Again, this doesn't mean that you have to have a mobile outreach office that is open 24 hours, has 5 advocates there. That's not feasible for all of us. But what that could mean is that we co-locate our services at our local hospital or our local urgent care. We work with the child care providers in our communities to host the parents night to just talk about what childhood sexual abuse could look like, right? We make sure that we are not just asking survivors to come in, but we are out and present in the places that survivors exist in our communities as well. Oops. Okay, here we go. Something else that these programs did was they supported secondary and provided community support for sexual violence. So this doesn't just mean offering the same crisis support that we offer directly to sexual violence survivors. This could be how we do education and awareness, but it can also mean offering supportive services. Something that we've seen is support groups for parents of children who experience child sexual abuse, right? That's what we've seen. We've seen services for partners, but we've also seen people dive into prevention work as well, and having these people who are related to survivors lead that work in their organizations. These organizations also had critical conversations and thought about how our organization is engaged with all different parts of our community. So again, who are those people who we're not reaching, and how are we going to plan to reach them? And when sexual violence happens that affects our larger community, they also know how, if, and when to respond to that. These programs also can say, hey, we don't have the capacity to do this right now, but we're going to partner with these people. So we're making sure that survivors in our community can still get what they need. Another example of some of the things we just talked about. A mom wants to find ways to support her toddler's safety after her eldest child disclosed sexual violence happening at school. After many discussions with the mom and the school, your organization is now an advisor of the school's parent-teacher alliance. You sit the safety subcommittee. Another way we could do this, you learn that she works at your local library. After a few weeks of coordinating, you're able to get the Baby and Me reading groups to pick 3 upcoming books focusing on consent and child bodily autonomy. The library is also planning on doing a spread of books for Sexual Assault Awareness Month. These are not things that you all have to do, but we just want to give you about some ideas how we can use the different entry points in our community that are still impacted by sexual violence and utilize our community resources and collaborations to still affect change in our community and make it safer for sexual violence survivors. And one of the other, and the last one we'll talk about today, traits of sexual violence programs is to have staff that are skilled in providing emotional support. So next, in part 2, we're gonna really focus on these and we're gonna go through the skills that we've identified, but here they are for right now. They're empathetic and active listening, choice points, they're skilled at safety planning, they're skilled at grounding, and they're skilled with helping people set boundaries. So if you want, go ahead, check out these resources before the next time we meet. They are available to you. Again, in part 2, we're really going to focus on how we can start to practice these skills, what they are and what they look like, to make sure that you all as advocates feel supported and ready to support survivors who might need them. Oh, and with that, and I left 15 minutes for questions just like I planned. That is all we have for you all today. Are there any questions? You have questions about certificates of completion or anything, or those type of questions, just stay on for one more second. I will definitely answer those. But are there any questions about anything you talked about today? Any other resources? Yeah. We also encourage you all to come back for part 2. If you haven't already registered, Alex has put that link in the chat for you all. Okay, it doesn't look like there are. I'm going to stop the recording. And again, thank you all so much for coming today.